And if you look here, I don't know if I can show you the thing.
Oh, you're ready, huh?
Yes,
Okay.
I've done things, um, mutilated your book for good purpose. But let me introduce you properly. My name is Frank Schaeffer, and you are watching and/or listening to a podcast program, live event called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And this is presently on YouTube. It goes to Facebook, etc. My guest today is a professor who wrote an article I read recently, contacted him, wanted to talk about the article, then found out about his book, and we're going to try to unfold all of this stuff. So um, let me introduce today's guest is Timothy William Waters. Do you go by Tim or Timothy?
Tim's fine, yeah.
Okay, Tim. And Timothy teaches on the laws of war, international criminal law, secession, and changes in states' borders. And he wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal, which I read a few weeks ago, called Genocide in My Classroom. And he is also the author of Boxing Pandora, which I've got right here, Rethinking Border States and Secession in a Democratic World. And let's see, what else do I need to say? Yes, please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts. And my Substack commentary is called It Has to Be Said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. So first, let's get to this article you wrote. The context was the furore that occurred when three presidents of three important schools showed up for a hearing and were unable to answer a simple question on genocide. One resigned, one left, was asked to leave, or maybe they both resigned. I don't know technically what. But then you wrote this incredible piece that I read, and I enjoyed it so much. It was called Genocide in My Classroom. Incitement is a crime, but I teach my students that there's a clear distinction between ideas and violence, by Timothy William Waters, Wall Street Journal, January 8, 2024. And in that piece, the reason I contacted you is I was kind of fishing around for somebody sensible who seemed to have the life wisdom we needed in that moment. And it seemed to me, Tim, that you were that guy. So I don't know if that's a good introduction or not, but
Thank you for setting the bar extremely high at the start of the interview, but I appreciate the comments.
Yeah, I mean, I found your commentary laced with both compassion, realism, experience, life experience, and since you were writing as someone who teaches the students that were being discussed in the hearing in terms of the demonstrations that have been going on in our schools. And so what I want to do is I just want to read something from this.
Sure.
And these are a couple little excerpts I have. If you're going to advocate genocide, please do it respectfully, in quotes. That's what I tell my students at the start of my course on war crimes. I'm not sure it would have gone over well in the recent congressional hearings on campus anti-Semitism. That line gets a laugh, but students know I'm serious because I say it in a speech about difference, discourse, and the reasons that they are in that classroom. And then you go on, and I'm condensing here. I require my students to speak, quote, respectfully. They must be civil. They shouldn't direct foul language or racial slurs at their classmates. I don't outright ban profane, vulgar, or racist words, given that we study the reasons people kill each other, but I limit their use. Respect also means not interrupting others and avoiding theatrical disapproval, rolling eyes, hissing. But vigorous disagreement through reasoned argument is encouraged. That's why we're here. Another place you say setting limits is hard, but whatever we think about protests and the public square, we can start by bringing back a radical commitment to open discourse in our classrooms. A university's core purpose is fulfilled by teaching and research. There, we should defend intellectual inquiry to the fullest. And so that's just some of what you said in this really interesting article. So first, let me just thank you for coming on and tell you what a pleasure it is to talk to somebody who wrote those words, and thank you for them. And then just ask what sort of reaction you got from people first before we get into your ideas on the
Sure,
article.
sure. Well, and thanks for the kind comments about it. The reaction, I'm happy to say, was more positive than negative. It certainly got some of both. I've written other things in the past that just received overwhelmingly hostile responses. This
Yeah.
one, and it may be partly a question of where it's published. That there's different kind of audience, so you get an audience that's keyed in a certain direction or attentive to it. But most of the people who either commented on the article publicly or wrote to me directly were positive. There was certainly a mix, and that's fine. And I'm happy also to note that most people, whether they agreed or not, were quite respectful. I didn't see a lot of people who were adopting a model that I wasn't advocating in terms of how to talk to other people. So
Yeah.
it was pretty positive. I was happy about it. I wasn't
Did
sure.
any of your current students who you have interactions with from the point of view of being a professor at this point, did any of them read it, or did you have them read it so you could talk about the
Oh
article
no,
that
I
talks
didn't.
about
I didn't
talking?
have them. I long ago abandoned the idea of making students read my. I mean, I've occasionally done it, but it's always just too awkward to your
Yeah.
own stuff. So I didn't do that. A couple students did tell me that they'd seen it, and
Mm,
the ones who did were all very positive. So, but okay, that's also a selective, self-selecting group, right? There might have been students who totally disagreed with this, because obviously it's a critique of a mindset and a point of view that's actually quite prevalent in
mm,
universities, both in faculty and administration and in students. So I would be surprised if there weren't students who strongly disagreed. I didn't
sure.
hear from any of them, and I don't. They may be in my class, but we've been going on having our discussions, which I think have been going better than usual in class. And I don't ascribe it to the article, but
Yeah.
to the kinds of maybe the times we're in, people are thinking more about this question, and that might actually have good effects on how discourse is taking place in the school. I hope.
Yeah, it's a subject obviously I'm interested in the sense that I earn my living as a writer. And there are a lot of things happening these days that I find very suspect and and troubling as a writer, irrespective of anybody's individual politics on any individual issue or their views on it. And that is this idea of just shutting down debate um, before it starts. And of course, publishers today, I wrote my first novel in 1989. It was published in 1990 called Portofino, and it was a story about a youth growing up in Europe with missionary parents, which happens to be my background that I left. But what's interesting to me is now when I revisit my work for some reason or think about it, I'm wondering how it would fare in the hands of today's sensitivity readers at the big publishing houses that want you to either put a trigger warning in because you use a word, or you describe something that might offend somebody. And it's a world that I didn't grow up in. I'm sort of a child of the 1960s, and you always thought of yourself as when I left my evangelical background, I kind of veered towards what you would think of, Enlightenment style humanism that comes hot out of the Renaissance and all the rest of this, and then and so forth. And then all of a sudden, my idea of the left or liberalism, liberal politics has been recalibrated to accommodate this group of people who basically want the trigger warning, who shout down people who speak who they disagree with on campuses that makes the news often, or from the right, people, we had Keith Boykin on the other day who's just written this book, Why Does Everything Have to Be About Race? Growing up Black and growing up gay, and bringing up issues of the very kind that would be banned in some Florida school districts today. So I guess with this podcast, one of the things we try to do is talk to people we disagree with. I mean, that sounds weird, but we also talk to people we agree with. And most people, you have
Well, it
things you
sounds like
agree
you'd fit
and
into a
disagree.
university at least in the classic model. I guess the question is whether you'd be comfortable in one today. And I don't
Yeah.
mean to overstate it. I mean, let me say outset, I actually think much of the debate is greatly overwrought. These are,
Yes.
universities are normal places filled with, regular people, decent folk, and critically of good faith. So even with some of the trends you described, I think it's clear that the people advocating those trends are doing so
Mm,
out of a position of a desire to help society, a good faith posture.
sure.
That doesn't mean it isn't having really deleterious effects on other parts of our traditions and society, such as
Mm,
the space for discourse. But I don't know many people who I think there are few who actively want to shut down discourse as
Right.
such because they see it as antithetical to a sort of post-liberal, not a classical liberal, a
Mhm.
modern progressive project. But most people think they're serving both, and we can see this in universities that have said, I think formally as their policies, that they promote academic discourse and
Mm.
commitments to diversity of the kind you were just describing. I think
Right.
that's a mistake to imagine that these are co-equal values, but that at least shows that people in these institutions haven't abandoned the idea of academic discourse. They just think that they can do both these things. And I think I saw a wonderful op-ed recently. I forget the author right now, laying out the many things universities are trying to do. And rather than criticize them, saying the problem is, can they really do all these things? Are there no
Yeah.
trade-offs and choices? And I
Yeah.
think this is a place where we do confront a kind of design choice. Are we going to reaffirm the discourse and deliberation, or think about these other values and make
Mm.
those the center? That's the challenge today.
Mm. Yeah, and the funny thing is, and we're going to get there, but it's an odd segue into your book here because,
Oh, well, right.
which you didn't mean to do, but Boxing Pandora, Rethinking Borders, States, and Secession in a Democratic World. This is a really unusual book. I read a lot, and I don't think I've ever read a book on secession before that advocates it as a means of perhaps improving the way we all get on together. When I was reading the book, I obviously started trying to think of a specific example. Some you mentioned, some you didn't. One of them that comes to mind is in the context of your piece on civilized discourse, how uncivil a lot of the global discourse is about difference. And one thing you didn't go into in depth in the book, you use various examples, Kosovo and other places and so forth. But I immediately thought of Ethiopia, where you have the oldest Orthodox church in the world. You have Islam beginning to come in pretty early into the Ethiopian context, and now it's about a third of the population. And then, in addition to that, you now have the Pentecostal Protestant movement, which has landed. You have, the end of a civil war for which somebody got a Nobel Peace Prize, I think with Eritrea, if I remember correctly.
Shortly before the next war began. Yes,
Yeah,
that's
before the next war began. And I was thinking about your book in the context of just that, the Ethiopian context. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, and these really are the same subject, so let's go there. I'm going
sure.
to, and forgive me for making it complicated, but um, was how does the idea of secession, as in allowing people to live in the group or on a map which makes sense for them, say, as opposed to the map drawn by the British in 1900 somewhere, um, whatever that may be, fit with the moment we're in when I'm 71 years old. If you had told me in 1968 or 1975, when you're an old guy, you're going to be living in a world that is going to be closer to the wars of religion of Edward III in England and, James and all these other people, the controversies, the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, than you are anything that looks like it comes from the Enlightenment or the Renaissance. In fact, there'll be a series of holy wars across the globe. There will be dictators like Putin stepping forth in the name of Russian Orthodoxy with the backing of his church. You're going to have a white Christian nationalist movement arising in America that will take over one of the political parties. And in fact, if you want to understand your present moment, you better study, the pre-Renaissance 1300s in Europe, because that's where you're going. Okay, I'm not going to talk anymore, but tell me how you can write about secession, how that idea is influenced by what I call the illogical players on the board, the people who are not interested in democracy or in referenda to allow people to choose. They are they just want the power, and that just seems to be combined with this push towards um, a religious-based view of the world that we have more and more, including Hindu nationalism and so on, that
Right.
I never saw coming. So I'll
Right.
shut up now.
Well, no,
How does that fit with your thesis? First of all,
yeah,
tell
no,
us the
I mean,
thesis
I
of the
think
book.
that's a great point. It's provocative, and I think it goes right to. So you mentioned earlier, just as a preface to this, that it's about talking with people you disagree with. I got a lot of good responses to my article. A lot of people disagree with my my book, to be sure. This is a very minority position in international law and relations, so
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with disagreement. So it goes right to your question, I think. I think the standard sort of common view and wisdom would be precisely because we have so many groups that seem illiberal, fundamentally uninterested in shared experience, that it
Mm.
would be dangerous to think about relaxing borders, treating secession as something that's, neutral, let alone a positive thing. I think that's the common intuition, and clearly my argument is counterintuitive in that sense, that it
Mm.
might be better to actually, shall we say, lean towards that. And one way to think of this is you've just described both the history of this planet and the world we currently live in. Remember, that's not my rule, right? We're,
Right,
we're
right.
living in a world in which, since World War II, we've had a model that says borders are locked
Mm.
and they're fixed, and we think that's a good thing. And I think it's fair to say the way you're describing that you're sort of surprised to find yourself in this world, that's partly because mid-century, I think we all would have thought we're placing a bet on a sort of modern, secularizing, liberal project,
Hmm.
at least in the West, different move in the other half of the world. But that was the expectation. In other words, this new world of fixed borders carried with it an assumption we're going to solve all the problems of our history
Mm.
by no longer contesting units, but treating people inside them as citizens. And I think
Yeah.
that the sort of empirical problem is precisely embedded in your observation. That apparently is not the world we actually live in. There are
Hmm.
large populations who, some of whom are illiberal, but others not. There are many people who have a strong religious or ethnic or other identity, or
Mm.
regional, who are also committed Democrats. So the one thing is to remember, it's not everyone who has some, shall we say, identity-based political position who is illiberal, but I
Mm.
grant you there are many. What do we do with that? Again,
Mm.
our bet is let's solve that inside existing units. And
Yeah.
my view is, that's not actually a formula for creative solutions. If nothing
Mm.
else, it takes one set of solutions off the table. If we say we're going to fix problem X, it could be Ethiopia, right? Or the problems of identitarian politics in a place like India, or on and on down the list, or
Right,
our own
right.
country. But one thing we will never do is alter the borders. At a minimum, we could say, all right, you've got like X number of tools minus one. I don't mean
Mm.
to simplify it because, of course, picking up that tool can also create collateral harms. I mean,
Yeah.
the standard argument is don't ever pick that tool up because it'll create, it's Pandora's box, right? It'll create all
Yeah.
kinds of
Yeah.
trouble. But what we miss, I think, is that's not only the creator of risk, it's also an opportunity to resolve the kinds of problems that you're describing that are, they're not just driven by identity, they're driven by demography. That is to
Yeah.
say, when a unit that's fixed
Mm.
has two populations in it that are sort of territorially identified, they feel themselves to be majorities in one area or another,
Mm.
but they're locked into a single unit through history. Well, there's a high risk that they're going to engage in a kind of uh, political struggle and
Sure.
for ultimate power. And we see this over and over again in
Mm.
many countries. And that creates all kinds of costs that are functions of our current system in which borders are locked. Right?
Mm.
If you have secession as an option, and of course my whole point is, could we imagine an option that was, if not peaceful, like marginally less violent than our current world? That's all I am
Yeah.
aiming.
Yeah. You'll settle for that.
Yeah, if we could do that, then we can resolve those kinds of problems
Mm.
through this mechanism, the ones that are, in a sense, created by the fact that we have fixed units. I think we need to be candid as a first step, even if you don't agree with where I go with it. We
Mm.
should, that's why I start the book with like a map of where we are.
Yeah.
We should recognize that the current system appears to create lots of collateral harms itself. And if people see that much, I feel I've already done the
Yeah, one
work
thing I
I
want to
wanted to.
interject quickly for
Sure.
anybody listening to this. I'm talking with Timothy William Waters, who is a professor and has written this book, Box, Boxing Pandora, Rethinking Borders, States and Secession and Democratic World. One of the points you make in the book, and I'll find the passage here in a minute, but one of the things that you say that I found interesting is that you're asking your reader not to confuse your vision with this sort of globalist idea that we're past borders altogether, that we don't need national borders, that it's all one big human family, and eventually there'll be a world government. This has nothing to do with what you're writing, unless I've completely
No,
misunderstood you.
that's
You're
absolutely
saying
right.
you're saying nation states are a thing. They're going to be here for a long time. Relax. But let's talk about how the borders are drawn, not just between nation states, but within them. And I'm going to, and I'm not being a smart ass here, but one of my reactions is, and it isn't what you're talking about because it wasn't by referendum, it was by fiat, but the partition of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh didn't work out terribly well. So is that a recent example of sort of trying this that hasn't worked well?
Well,
And then I want to get to what you really do right and not be
yeah,
a
so
smart
let's go right at that one, and then I want to maybe say first, you're right. I'm not talking about like a cosmopolitan, borderless world. I think
right,
that's not realistic. So my argument, as radical as it may be, is actually very conservative.
right.
I think we should recognize that states are a really sticky like technology. They're not
Yes.
going away, and therefore it's important to figure out how to get them right or think about peaceful change.
Yeah.
Frankly, if I can accept that my argument is idealistic and in some sense unrealistic, but I think a borderless cosmopolitan world is wildly unrealistic. We're not heading in that direction. There's actually very little evidence of it. So yeah, I placed my bet on how to deal with borders. And at a minimum, we can say, yeah, we may be heading towards a global borderless society, but we're not going there in the next 5, 10, 15, 50 years. So this is at least a handbook for the next few decades and
Yeah.
possibly forever. So about India, this is a great example. I do mention it in the book. This is a challenging case in a way because yes, the Indian partition is extraordinarily violent and
Mm,
disruptive, and it looks like, good Lord, we don't want to do that. In fact, it's a pretty common critique of the kind of position that I'm making.
mm.
Few people make along with me. Um, I could imagine sort of trying to distinguish it and explain why it's like, oh, the British are to blame. It was badly done.
Sure.
Uh, I think there's a much better answer, though. Is yes, that's right. This can go very badly. It can be incredibly costly.
Mm.
But you also mentioned Bangladesh, and of
Yeah.
course that comes later. That
Mm.
is actually even more violent, I think, by most measures, the number
Yeah.
of people killed and displacement, and that is not quite the same thing because that is primarily best understood, I think, as the attempt to crush a secession. And
Mm.
so that's
Mm.
something in other words, let's think about creating a ledger. I'm not denying that
Yeah.
there are
Yeah.
harms that come with secession or partition, which are very similar phenomena.
Hmm.
There are also harms that come from trying to maintain our existing units. And I think that Bangladesh is on that side of the ledger, right?
Mm.
Many countries, Pakistan as a state opposed it. The US at the time, from a real political perspective, wanted to hold the Pakistani state together. So we were sort of supporting and greenlighting that. And the
Mm.
costs were just enormous. So at a
Mm.
minimum, I think we have to acknowledge that yeah, secession can lead to terrible results, and so can the attempt to
Yeah, and so it
prevent it.
can keep everybody in the same
Yeah.
thing. And I'm going to get back to this. And again, this is not a smart ass question. It's kind of fun, but of course, there's a secessionist group in Texas now. It's fairly serious. And then we have our own political divides between the Republican Party becoming the MAGA party controlled
Right.
by Trump and this other thing. They also fall in geographical realms of red America, blue state America. So this isn't a far-fetched question, I think, for us. But let me do something better here in terms of introducing this in setting up Boxing Pandora, which I love the book, actually. It's very well written, and I so enjoyed
Oh, thank you.
how you think through things and how you set forth your argument. It's really good. But you say, I make three assumptions of my own. This is in the introduction. First, human beings have diversities. Almost everyone is a citizen of some state, but many people have connections to more than one. People also belong to other communities, tribes, social classes, associations, churches, ethnic groups, nations, gender, and sexual orientation, ideological communities that may matter more to their daily lives and worldview. And you're kind of setting up the idea that within our countries, there's a lot of people who really belong to other things besides just that nation. And, you think of the divisions in our own country, that comes up. And then you go on a little later and say states won't disappear. Something like the modern state is the default for much of political and social life on the planet. Its qualities change as they always have, but there is a predictable minimum of functions and influence we can expect most states to exhibit. And then you go on a little later and you say that the third assumption is that those physical beings, that's people, expect to govern themselves, a recent trend, but one likely to continue. And then you say these three assumptions help frame our question. If states aren't going away and democratic processes increasingly displace other principles and humans have diverse identities, what can we expect? Then later, like way later, let me just see where I want to go. Down, I found something on page 243 that really I thought tied in with some of those opening statements and would
I'm
help
glad to
us.
hear that you didn't find that it contradicts those opening statements.
No, no,
You've done
and
your
it helped.
research.
So you say toward the end of your book in the conclusion section, you say we live in a shared world and we impose on each other in every way. We impose if we divide countries and if we hold them together. We impose when we maintain a legal order that makes secession nearly impossible. And we impose if we change that order to make secession easier. The true measure and the only test is the degree to which our impositions allow human beings to exercise choice and agency, and if, on the margins, the result is a better world. And I thought that statement tied in very well with some of your introductory things. And I have a lot of other things marked in the book, but I just thought I wanted to set up what you're really saying, and then I'd like you to just talk a little more about what the book says in total, and then we can get into some interesting specifics that I think, again, tie very well in an odd way into your Wall Street Journal article. Or was it, did I say Wall Street Journal or Washington Post? Wall Street Journal
Wall Street
article.
Journal, that's right.
Yeah, about civil discourse in the classroom, because it's really part of the same subject, because that civil discourse is the kind of discourse people will have to have if secession isn't a civil war, where you're talking about who you are as a group and the kind of freedom you want to gather yourselves in a different way within, say, the borders of a country or change those borders.
Well, that's a great point because, and I see the connection. I like what the connection you've made there. I hadn't thought about the article in that way, but apparently I wrote both, right? It must be
Yeah,
in my
you wrote
mind.
both. It's out of your head.
Yeah, right. Because it's true that one of the things that really always troubled me and that I was trying to push back on in the book is the idea, the assumption that secession is always somehow a withdrawal from community and therefore problematic. When
Mm,
I thought it's actually also a way to respect diversity or difference in a larger community, which is our globe, and that it might be all right to have one more unit
mm,
and it relates to this idea of how we should have a meaningful, diverse discourse. With again, for me, it was important to suggest that thinking more, openly about secession isn't against the idea of human diversity, but
mm,
actually is an expression of it. And that's what I wanted to bring out through the points that you raised, both at the
mm.
introduction and at the end. Yeah. You wanted me to say something about the sort of what the argument of the book is? Is that what you were
Yeah, I'd
asking?
like you to just, again, I've tried to set it up with some quotes here, but there's a lot in this book and I really like it. But if you were describing it to someone
Sure,
overall,
sure. Well, so I guess if it made just the short sort of outline of the argument is I wanted to make a really sort of large scale critique. I used to work on particular countries in the Balkans, and I came to see that this was part of a much larger
hmm,
problem, and that is to say that it was a feature of our world that's sort of global in its nature. It's part of the post World War II settlement that helps create the world we're in. And so I thought it needed like a global critique, not just one country, but something about the rules, both legal and informal, that shape it. And the biggest one of those, as I say, is the decision to use what we call territorial integrity, to lock in units and protect
hmm,
them against external attack, which I think is a great idea. We should, limit the right of other countries to invade. But
yeah,
we also, at the same time, sort of protected states against being divided by their own population. We made
hmm,
that really hard too. And behind it was this assumption that borders are, fixed borders are stabilizing and that they should reduce violence and make politics, easier and better for the whole planet. And my whole operating assumption is what if that's not true? What if borders are actually producing instability? What if,
hmm,
they're the problem? And that's what the whole book is about, is like sort of setting up the assumption and the world we live in,
hmm,
trying to push on why those assumptions might be wrong, and then only then, if you're with me that far, that maybe we're not actually sure that this rule's doing what we think, what might we do differently? So
Mm.
I consciously devised the book that the first half is just to describe the world we live in and critique it, because nobody's going to listen to my idea for a different rule if they think this is like the best possible
Sure.
world we're already in. So what I go through in the sort of the heart of the book, after
Mm.
explaining how we got to where we are, from the sort of the old Wilsonian model, which says find where people are who share an identity and then build a
Yeah.
border around them. We don't live in that world. Ever
Yeah.
since World War II, we've said use the units that are here, states and colonies,
Hmm.
call those the self-determining units, and the people who live in them are called like a legal people. Okay, so in other words, it has nothing to do with what their identities are, their values, anything else. It's just like people living in a place on a map, but that becomes the unit that has like legal and I would say moral value.
Yeah.
That's really the problem I want to challenge. And we went with this rule, as I say, because we think it creates stability. And that means we think if we had open borders or more open borders, we'd have endless numbers of states, we'd have
Mm.
ethnic cleansing, people would not cooperate in the governance of their own state, all problems like this. And the main point is, the first thing I try to make as a point of the book is it's actually really hard to test this rule. So like as
Mm.
I put this part, many people disagree with my book. This part I've never heard much disagreement with from social scientists, for example. How would you test whether a global rule of territorial integrity
Sure.
is working? It's actually really hard to do. It's just been a rule at all
Mm.
times since 1945. But we do have some indications. Let me know if I'm going on too much about
No,
this.
not at all. I'm so interested.
Okay,
Better than me retelling your book to you.
there you go. So there are some ways to measure whether these assumptions are actually working or not. And
Mm.
I can just give you a couple examples. One is this idea that if we have more relaxed borders, we're just going to have endless fracturing into more and more states. This is a pretty common argument. Like, oh,
Yeah.
there'll be thousands of states, because if you think of like linguistic identities, there are 6,000 languages. We'll have 6,000 states. What this misses, I think, is that there are also countervailing incentives to integrate
Mm.
units. And in fact, units have become larger over time for the most part. The best example and I mentioned in the book is something like the European Union,
Yeah, I was going
which
to say that.
even though Britain has exited, right, it's still on over time on balance has been a highly integrative project. States that were completely sovereign said, let's give up some of our sovereignty to a
Yeah.
central authority that governs much of our life. Um, that's a strong indicator. And of course, there are also military alliances, economic alliances. It's just not true that the only incentive in life is to break away and be smaller. It's a dangerous world, and there are lots of benefits from economies of scale. And so we see that actually there's not a lot of evidence that people will necessarily leave. And one of the best examples is in the few places in which um, uh, states have let a group vote, decide, do they want to leave or not, they don't always leave. Right? We had
Yeah.
a referendum in Scotland, we had one in Quebec, Catalonia,
Yeah. And
and
the Scots stayed with the United
that's
Kingdom.
right. In each of these cases, we've
And
had,
of course,
well, let me get
it's up for
complicated.
grabs in Northern Ireland. And
Right,
now they're
right.
both sharing power again. As of last week, they're sitting
So
there
there's,
in
there's
Stormont
actually
again.
great example. There's a wonderful example. I have to tell you this one. It comes from the Scottish case. It's one of my favorite anecdotes about this to
Mm.
sort of demonstrate, do people only think with blood, and are they always thinking in terms of like illiberal
Yeah.
identities? During the referendum back in 2014, the government of Scotland, which was pro-secession, put out
Yeah.
a bunch of white papers to explain the policies. And there was one was about media. And in it,
Mm.
they said to the Scottish people, if we become independent, don't worry, you'll still be able to watch EastEnders and Strictly Come Dancing, on the
Yeah.
BBC,
Yeah.
right? So there's your Scottish nationalism. It's not people like painting themselves blue and crying freedom. They
Yeah.
want independence, some of them, but they also want
They
to
still want the
still,
BBC.
yeah, they want their BBC, right? And so this
Yeah.
is, I mean, a great indication. It's just not true that fracturing always happens. And the last
Yeah.
thing I'd say about it, one of the themes I have in the book is we are constantly mixing like facts and norms in our assumptions about how this world works.
Mm.
Even if you think we might have more countries, is that a problem? What is the
Yeah.
correct number of countries in the world, and how big ought they be? It's just
Mm.
not clear. It'd be really awkward to say, let's go back to 1945 and use that number of countries,
Yeah.
because there'd be a lot of colonies still. So, if we had 20
Well, and you
more
can look at the
countries,
breakup of the Soviet Union,
yes,
and
right.
places like Lithuania and Latvia don't want to be folded back into the bigger context. They're quite happy doing their
Right.
thing.
This default towards existing units are better, and larger are better because somehow we should be moving towards like global integration in one country.
Yeah.
Even though that's
And I
not the
think an
trend.
argument that works for you, if you were just sort of debating the point, would be, my question to anybody about any idea is, well, give it some time, and then I'd like to come back and ask you a simple question. Well, how did that work out for you?
Right, right.
And we do have good evidence of how the colonial process of drawing big chunky borders with rivers and mountains, and we'll just put the line here between Jordan and whatever, and this is we'll call this Iraq, because the French and the British decided to do that or whatever, has not worked out very well, because you have not just religious differences between Sunni and Shiite and all the rest, and tribal stuff and language. And I think a big chunk of African instability comes from the same thing. And where did any of these nation states come from in terms of any kind of organic grouping? Whereas the
That's right.
countries that have that organic grouping tend to be the places that work better and, aren't
I think one of
attacking.
the hard, that's right. I think one of the hard challenges I agree with that point. The challenge, I think, is that when you look at the places that have sort of so-called organic borders,
Mm,
certain places in Europe, for example, they are, of course, the consequence of hundreds of years of coercion, violence, and just demographic pressures, but they
yeah,
don't come in a pretty way. And so
yeah,
when one might say, do we really want to go through that again just for the sake of like organic authenticity? And I can
yeah.
accept we don't. One thing to note, and we'll come, I guess, to my specific proposal, but on this point, a lot of people, if they're looking at a critique of existing states, they
Mm,
focus on the sort of ahistoricity and injustice of existing borders. And as
yeah.
we will get to, I think that's plausible, but I don't base my argument on that because I think that's like ultimately a dead end in
Mm.
terms of justifying this. There are strong reasons why that shouldn't be the basis for claims and why that actually is going to lead to more violence. We need to find a different way to think about
Yeah, and I
why
think
we
what
would
you're
change
saying
it.
there is it can't always be about the oppressed and the oppressor, because it always depends on your point of view, who's who.
That's right.
And if you do a little digging, you find that it's a little more complicated than that. It's not just good guys and bad guys. There's a lot of,
Everyone wants justice, and
yeah,
unfortunately, no one can agree on what it is. I mean, Israel Gaza is a wonderful example or a
good
terrible
example.
one, but we can
Yeah,
think of many, right? If that's our principle, historical justice,
yeah.
it
Good
sounds
luck.
great and abstract, but no community will agree. And in fact, in many cases, the majority in a
Yeah.
state believes that those borders are its historical justice. So bad
Mm.
luck for the minority that's stuck inside it. So we need a
I'm going to
different
go there
mechanism.
in a minute and ask you
Sure.
something, but I just want to jump into another passage here. We cannot know with certainty, but we can know certain things about the present rule and can speculate about an alternative. If for the moment we place the question of instability to the side, we see that the new rule is in important ways more just. It allows more people to live in states of their own choosing and fewer to live as minorities. But then, and inevitably, and then I want you to get into the conclusions of your book, and we have plenty of time to do that. And by the way, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest today is Timothy William Waters. Timothy writes and teaches on the laws of war, international criminal law, secession, and changes in states and borders. He wrote an article which drew my attention to his work, Genocide in My Classroom in the Wall Street Journal in January, which I read a bit of at the beginning of this interview. And he's the author of this book that we're talking about, Boxing Pandora, Rethinking Borders, States and Secession in a Democratic World. And I am asking you to please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And one reason I'd like you to do that subscribing is that I talk to people like Tim about complicated subjects, and we talk about things like wars and secession, and the stupid algorithms on the stupid online crap we're on pick the words out, and all of a sudden it's like we don't let people advocate for, and they've just heard, the things heard the word, and so we're trying to get more people on Substack so we can avoid the stranglehold of weird algorithmic things that, they always put us back on again because we're not the thing they think, but it really has gotten very stupid out there. When it comes to
My
this stuff.
sympathies, and just a note: my rule for secession has no algorithm in it. So
Yeah, okay, good. Well, let's hope it's not tagged as a word now that, Meta says you can't say. So, okay. One thing I wanted to bring up is just a couple of US examples. We've got some secessionist movements from the right here in this country. guys, marching around with open carry weapons in Texas, claiming that they want to be their own thing. We don't have a very good history here with the Civil War. Obviously, this is sort of an elephant in the room because we're right in the middle of MAGA Trump politics. Before we go to your conclusion in your book, what you really are advocating, let's deal with something right here close to home, which is, the craziness of the MAGA movement that contains within it people who really don't feel they're part of America anymore as America now stands. And a lot of these folks want out. And I'll just do one more thing. Yesterday, I did a podcast with a very interesting person who's a historian of religion, and we were talking about the homeschool movement. And this does connect because a lot of those folks are not just interested in educating their child. They want to educate those children away from the world they no longer approve of. They have already seceded into a home or a small church community. They no longer regard themselves part of the United States. That, for instance, includes my producer, Ernie, who is gay and married to his husband, Rock, and has been together with 20 years. They don't want to be part of a country that allows that. They've pulled their kids out of the public school system. They're teaching them from a totally different book than anything you're going to see in the schools. They have seceded already. So I'd just like to ask you, as someone who studies all these things, how does our present political context in this country, where you already have people pulling back from the idea that we're all one country, and this flag sort of means the same thing to all of us, into these little enclaves, left and right, a lot of folks on the left canceling you if you use the wrong pronoun. It's not a right-wing problem. But we're already in such a moment of division. Then you come along saying basically, well, secession may not be a bad idea.
Here's a way to divide further.
Here's a way to divide further. We got 50 states and thousands of counties. Let's just, the evangelicals can all move to Texas, and Ernie will just have to move, to Massachusetts because we're more liberal and we'll be nice to him and Rock. I'm being facetious, but not really, because we're in a weird moment. And I'm picking your brain here, not on the book, but you, because you're a smart, wise person.
Well, so I think, and this goes back to what you said before. I think you rightly noted that there is a kind of linkage to the article in the Wall Street Journal. How do we deal with difference? And there, of course, it looks like we're saying we should stay together and have discourse. But the key is acknowledging that we don't agree, right? Creating a space in which we don't agree. And what you're now describing is, I made the argument, it's actually vital that in a university, we should hold that space in a sort of an agnostic, open condition.
Yeah.
But I also said in the article, universities aren't about doing anything. They're about learning. We don't do anything there in the classic sense. It's to learn how to go out and do. Well, and now you're asking about what about the doing in the world? Because the world outside the university, the one we're living in, this country, yes, has these real cleavages and divides, such that some people might say, as you rightly point out, I'd like to withdraw, right, from this into my own inner space, or hey, how about I read this new book, how about actually withdrawing from the country? I think the place where the connection exists for me is, if we're serious about the idea of democracy and discourse, it doesn't just mean stay in the room. It also means respecting people's choices. And by the way, the possibility of withdrawing from the conversations available to both, right? So one frame is, oh, I don't, Ernie doesn't want to live in a society where people don't respect. That's true. There are other people who feel that the fact that the people who are the current, very small, but, persistent secession movements, they feel alienated from what they see as a society with very different values.
Yeah.
We can argue about whether they're the right values or not, but we can also observe, I think we should observe, that those are human beings with formed values and views that maybe should have consequence in a deliberative and democratic society. And that one solution indeed is, if enough people in an area, and I'm going to sort of get to like, how would we measure that? But if enough people share that view, maybe they should be able to act upon it. After all, if enough people in this country feel the way of the views that you described, they'd actually win elections, right?
Yeah.
And then we'd have a very different question for people saying, maybe we'd like to exit. So my point is, I personally, I wrote an op-ed in the LA Times right after Trump was elected about whether California should secede. I'm from California. And my view was they should absolutely have the right to make that choice. I hope they don't, because I want to live in my own country and not be a foreigner with a passport to visit my own home. But that they should choose, I think that would be the right democratic choice. And this is to your point, supposing they choose to stay, right?
Hmm.
That's a reaffirmation of our common space.
Hmm.
But I think you can't have a genuine conversation about difference, discourse, and shared political values if you've locked the door and said, oh, by the way, no one gets to leave. Then it's a kind of demographic and political struggle.
Yeah, that too was tried. And as you say, the Berlin Wall where it used to stand has all the little white crosses where people were shot trying to
Right, right.
cross,
That's a
which
bad,
is which is
literal
in your
locking.
book, by the way. And I can find the page if you want, but I know it's there.
So I'd rather have a society. I mean, I recognize sort of the irony of saying that people are going to engage in discourse with the consequence of exiting. That sounds like they're leaving the conversation. But if that's their genuine desire based on what they see and value, I'm
Hmm.
not sure what the reason for opposing it
For keeping them.
is, right?
Can I ask you one question
Sure.
just and this because the problem is your description of what you teach leads me to want to ask you everything because essentially between laws of war, international criminal law, secession, and changes in states' borders, and I happen to love reading history and biography, so this is an hour of eating chocolate for me.
Glad to hear
And
that. I also teach a class on World War I, so we could just
yeah, I
keep
love
going,
it.
you know.
And so I have a question for you. And just as one American citizen to another, I had a son that served in the Marine Corps and fought in Afghanistan at the beginning of that war. Thank God he got out. He's living across the street with his wife and three beautiful children for whom I do grandchild care every single day of the week. They were just here for lunch. They had a half day. And I made them some pizza and we all sat around talking and then we played Crazy Eights. And that's what life is about. Um, and that's what the whole story is for me. That said, I am aware of the fact that I live in a very dangerous planet, that in World War II, the UK would have lost, and Germany would be, in whatever mutation it is now, ruling a good chunk of the world, with the National Socialists having come to realize a big chunk of their thousand-year right. I'm glad for American power. I'm not ashamed of it. And that includes having founders who were slaveholders. This is a horrible, real, difficult, imperfect world. You're glad for whatever scraps that give you the peace and stability to have lunch with your grandchildren you can get. And part of the reason I can have lunch with my grandchildren every day is that we have a tremendous military and a vast reach of power across the world that we use unjustly a lot. Um, that said, I wouldn't want to see California secede, and I don't want to see Texas secede because I feel safer in a big, powerful, fearful country than I do in a fragmented country that's fighting endless culture wars that ends in new geographical divisions that begin to look like the Balkans. And that's a dark sort of vision, but I am a liberal. I believe in American power. I'm glad to live in its shadow, and I will accept the imperfections while working for something better. But I'm glad to be here. How do you respond to that? Because you
So
understand war and history.
that makes perfect sense. I basically share the intuition. I guess the thing that I would sort of amend to it, not even disagree, but add to it,
Mm,
which comes out of the kind of argument I'm thinking about in the book, is and how do we preserve and strengthen that shared union? Because I think
mm,
you're right. We're better off. I agree. I mean, as I said, I don't want California to secede, both for personal reasons and I think for
right.
the ones about stability you described. The units do create friction. It's true. So you'd have to manage that if Texas were independent and the Northwest and so forth. So if we could stay together as a country, that's actually better. But the question is, can we, as you pointed out, we're in a very fraught time.
Mm,
If the tools available to us to maintain our unity as a state
mm,
themselves are part of what drives us. I don't think this is really true here, but it's true in a lot of countries, are what drive us towards conflict and division.
yeah.
Then we should recognize that we may be paying too high a price
Yeah.
for that. And after all, if your point is, as you mentioned, you framed that in terms of things like military power and
Mm,
stability. If we arrive at the place where we are, in a sense, fighting another civil war to preserve our union,
sure. That's not going to work.
in a sense, we've defeated our own goal, right? Because
Mm,
we have to preserve this country to maintain stability, lest they have fractures and different units that are contesting, but we're fighting a war to preserve that. I mean,
yeah.
I respect Lincoln as well, but I hope that today, if we reach the point where a state or a region said we'd like to depart, I
Hmm.
would hope that the correct, humane, and God willing constitutional response would be, let us negotiate your exit, rather
Hmm.
than deploying that military, which is very formidable,
Hmm.
to prevent that. After all, as I say, if nothing else, that would be an ironic turn if our goal was to avoid
Yeah.
conflict and instability by locking everyone in. And again, I don't know that we're near that, but many countries, that's a very real and I think compelling description of what's
Hmm.
actually happening, is that their
And
unity is
how do you
preserved by
deal with
force.
a lack of goodwill? We see a whole stretch of Africa now becoming, single ruler dictator states for life, swatches of post-colonial Africa that were supposedly democratic for a while. Now they're even having trouble in Senegal as of this week. That was always an oasis of stability. All their neighbors are military juntas, etc. It's coming to pieces again. Um, in that context, it's just you're not dealing with people who are going to have referenda on deciding that this particular northern part of wherever has more Pentecostal Christians and they want to separate themselves from the Muslims. The terrorist forces that are loose in that region of the world and the dictators who are taking over are not going to read your book and say, "Oh, well, good."
What a great
Timothy
idea, right?
William Waters has given us the way to do this peaceably. Basically, they don't give a crap about peace, anything. These are the kind of people that raid girls' schools, steal the girls, rape them, take the boys into the bush and train them to become child soldiers. This is so far away from anything. And even in the US, I still think that guy, open carry guy in Texas somewhere that I see a picture of, demanding secession, carrying his, whatever he's carrying in front of a state house, he and I do still have something in common because we could both talk about what sort of a country we feel safe in. And I think he and I would agree that Hiroshima and Nagasaki notwithstanding, I am glad for the US nuclear arsenal because it's what has stood between me and chaos for a whole generation. And we could still agree about the fact that, okay, if you want to be a little separate from the rest of us, go do it. But then let's do the British thing. You be Northern Ireland and we'll be Wales and Scotland and the UK. You can have your own parliament, make abortion illegal and draft everybody into your version of the Home Guard. But we still are going to have some sort of a national cohesiveness to project this power that defends us across the globe. I don't know. I mean, that's kind of crazy thinking, but it just seems to me that in the US, one of the things I'm grateful for that is in spite of the culture war, MAGA, Trump, et cetera, we are still the lucky few. And the rest of the world envies this and they're trying to crash into the party, not because we're falling apart, but because we offer a level of stability and cohesion that everyone else envies, everybody at
Right,
this
right.
point.
And so why should we alter this model, right?
Why should we alter this
Yeah.
model?
So let me say two things. One on a point that was right in the middle of that, which is one of the most common critiques of anyone who thinks secession should be more possible, is why not federalism or autonomy, the kind of things you described, right? And I think that misses the point. I'm fine with federalism, autonomy, and minority rights. These are perfectly good tools for ameliorating, you know, group-based difference and conflict in a society. The question is, and when those don't work, what do we do? All right. So nothing in my book, nothing says don't use federalism or autonomy or minority rights or anything like that or democracy to ameliorate the tensions in your society. But recognize that often those things won't actually be sufficient. And there are many examples where
Yeah.
that's not enough. So I'm all for all those things that you said, right? Give people the chance to make
Hmm.
their own choices regionally, but they may still say, you know what, I just don't want to be a minority in your country, right? That's a fundamental critique that
Yeah.
society, it's something that human rights, for example, really can't answer to, is what is it, what is the justification for being not the majority, but the minority if it's just a function of borders? I don't think
Hmm.
we have a good answer to that, and we should respond to that. So to your other point, this is the other thing. How do we think about doing this in a harsh, dangerous
Hmm.
world? First, I'd say the fact that it's so dangerous, the kinds of examples you give is why we should look for a solution. It's a
Yeah.
terrible world for many people who are in the wrong state. But it is difficult. You may notice the last chapter is called The Hardest Part. I had
Yeah.
it fought, dragged kicking and screaming to even write it because I was initially content to say, this is an idea, this
Yeah.
is the theory. I recognize it's unlikely to be implementable, but I
Mm,
want to put the idea out there and let it percolate in the world. Okay, but I was convinced, well, say more than that, right?
mm, mm.
There are some pathways. I mean, first of all, there's no chance of this becoming like a global treaty norm or
Right, right.
something. So we have to think about being opportunistic state by state. There are occasionally countries where, despite the general tendency of most states to resist any idea of secession, once in a while they see a reason that they're for it, like in a place like Kosovo. Okay, so
Yeah,
there are opportunities to develop the argument that maybe we should be open to this. Also, you mentioned, like, yeah, this is people, dictators aren't going to listen to this. That's true.
yeah, yeah.
But there are decent countries that are marginally more likely to. So that's a place we can focus, the
Mm,
Britons of the world, for example. And my argument is actually drawn upon those kinds of countries. And I don't think
yeah.
we should dismiss that. These are decent societies. Okay, they're wealthy, they have more advantages, but that's right. Societies that are stable and wealthy are statistically, shall we say, more likely to be the ones that are at least less hostile to this idea,
Mm,
right? The places where it has happened, the rare few, are really good countries: Canada, Spain,
yeah, yeah.
United Kingdom. And I think we shouldn't discount that, but treat that as a model. And the last thing to note, it is really hard. I don't expect the dictators to listen to my book or to
Yeah.
anyone else. But one way to think of this is a strategy to the degree it's got some traction, or it could. If you think about something like human rights, which I also teach from time to time, this is
Mm,
there's no enforcement mechanism. There's no way to
right, right.
ensure this. What the strategy of human rights is to put the idea out there, to shape behavior, sometimes shaming actors, but like getting them to internalize norms. And I think it's like that we should
Yeah,
think of the idea of secession like a human rights norm. We don't expect actors to comply with it immediately. We're trying to shape their behavior, and this is a key point. I'm glad you raised this because it allows me to say something I don't know that is clear. It
mm.
looks like I'm advocating for secession. I'm actually agnostic. I'm not for it or against it. I
Yeah,
think
no, no, I get that from the
a
book.
right of it. And one of the key reasons is I don't necessarily think groups need or should or even want to be independent. What they want is a better deal. And
Mm.
right now, like diplomatically and legally, a minority has very few cards to play
Well,
against the
Spain,
United
even,
States.
which is a European country, they've have whole swaths of the Spanish public that
Exactly.
don't
A
feel like
really
they're getting a
decent
say.
country like Spain actually has very little space. So my
Yeah.
whole thought is what we need to do is think about a human rights style vocabulary that
Mm.
creates a place, a claim that can be used by these actors to kind of triangulate this debate, right? Not just you
Yeah.
and the state, but you and the state and some kind of legal claim that gives you, like, let's say, 1% better position to
Yeah.
negotiate. And that means like negotiating a better deal in your own country, not
Yeah.
necessarily exiting.
Yeah. One, in terms of the human rights issues that you talk about, I forget what page I'm on here. I think it's 137. You're saying occupation, class, and gender don't produce similar territorial effects. There have never been large parts of the Earth's surface populated by only by dentists or only millionaires or only women, because such groups would find themselves without patience, people to clean their mansions, or the still most popular means of creating the next generation. But it is common to find areas in which most people speak French, are Muslim, have very dark skin, and the like. That's not necessarily a reason to base politics on those features. In the case of dark skin, it's a terrible reason, but that distribution is a fact, a factor in governing people on territory in ways dentistry and gender never are. And I just wanted to say that one of the things that I harp on a lot, and have always talked about for years and write about and continue to write and speak about, is that we have to always pick our fights, and I'm always interested in any thesis that anybody puts forward for anything to do with politics or rights. Um, how do you define a quest for justice? And what do we mean by kind of overarching principles? And it seems to me that the biggest fight of our era is not racial, and it's not specifically religious, although both of these things have a huge impact on it. I believe that it's still women's rights. And I think women are treated horribly across the planet. I think huge swaths of religion, including Islam, which cannot duck this, including Christianity, and its abhorrence of having women in the pulpit, which only very recently, in an eye blink away, has changed. the Roman Catholic Church still sticking with it. I think this is a huge issue. So a question I would put to you is there a baseline of morality and equality that we should demand from anybody who has any idea, not just about secession, but even statehood, in the sense that if you fall below that line, and I'll just be blunt, I think Saudi Arabia, for instance, is an illegitimate nation. I think anything based on the subservience of women, the entire 52% of your population, should not exist as a nation state. I don't think Germany should have continued to exist as an anti-Semitic state murdering Jews. I'm glad they lost the war. I think that I'm glad the North won the war against the South. Slavery is illegitimate. And one point I don't know if you deal with somehow, and I missed it. And let's say all my examples there are wrong and you disagree. I'd like to hear your opinion on that. But I think there is a level of human rights below which no one should be cut any slack at all. And that, so if some group comes along and says, look, we're already treating our women like shit, but we don't even like the rights they do have. Not only are we not going to let them drive or vote, but if they don't cover their heads, we're going to rape them in police stations.
Yeah, okay, so I see the question. Yeah.
I think there's a level below which on just let's just say we need a template to put.
Right.
Is it racism? Is it anti-Semitism? Okay, I'm choosing another one.
So I didn't.
How do you treat women?
I didn't specify it in the book, but I do say as a general principle, recognizing or allowing secession doesn't mean you have to allow every secession. And we could imagine putting in place, specific human rights standards, women's rights. It could be many things. I chose not to say what they ought to be. I think that's a separate conversation. But of course we can do that. It's interesting to note, we don't do that for existing states, right? States are supposed to obey human rights, but we just have no concept or mechanism for the dissolution of an existing.
Hey, if you pay enough, behavior. I'll go play golf in Saudi Arabia and the hell with women.
So I think it'd be a great advance if we said, we're going to demand that any new country meet a very high standard of protections, and we're going to hold you to it, and we're going to have international protection, or monitoring, but we're going to allow you to do it if you meet that standard.
And I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example. Right now, I'm looking at all these news photographs of Houthi rebels gathered to protest something. I don't see a woman's face in the crowd. And in my head, that totally delegitimizes them. Anytime I see any group of anybody doing anything that is totally male, you have to choose your lens, and my lens is, race is a lens, gender is a lens, how gay people are treated lens, but I have a real shorthand thing. You want to know the legitimacy of any state or human or marriage or relationship? I just have one question. How are you treating women? Because it's a good one.
Yeah, and I think the one way to think of it in relation to this broader question is that is a perfectly plausible standard that we don't hold existing countries to. And we don't have any mechanism to make it happen. So I'd be willing to say, let's make new countries allow them to come into existence if they meet at least whatever the same standard we currently ask, or maybe even a higher one. So that I mentioned in the book, you can put like higher standards in place for new countries. We do it all the time. We don't hold the old ones to. So we could pick a human right. In other words, ironically, being open to secession could be a kind of ratchet to increase protections for women or racial minorities. You pick the things you think count, and if you make those a mandatory part, but then allow the possibility for human beings who meet those standards to engage in a kind of democratic process of deliberation as to whether they want to exit, well, we'd be already in a different world than we are today, and it might actually be an additional mechanism to make the world more just. I was trying to make a very minimal argument.
No, I know that. I'm not saying you should have put that in your book. I'm just talking to you.
No, it's a
Tim,
great
because
idea.
You teach these things.
Yeah, no, it's a fine idea. I wish we'd apply it to existing states. But if we did, I'd say one thing about maybe a slight amendment to what you said. If we were to like terminate the state of Saudi Arabia or Germany.
Yeah, well, it's not up to us to terminate anybody, but I sure as hell aren't going to play golf there. Right. And I'd like to talk to all my military friends who made one of my books into a bestseller.
If we did that, we'd have to say, and what about the people who live there, right? They're still there. They have some relationship to that space. Think about their governance in the future. And that's what I'm mostly concerned with.
Yeah, and the people who live there that I talk to.
People are.
I remember meeting a Saudi princess who was on her way back to Riyadh one time in Heathrow, and she was dressed beautifully, and we had a wonderful conversation. And she said, after talking to for 2 hours, because my plane was delayed, she said, well, back to jail. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, you'll see in a minute. And she disappeared to the ladies' room and came out swathed in black. And she says, I have to get off the plane looking this way. It was lovely talking to you as a human. And, that was a seminal moment for me. So I have a suggestion for the Saudi women. Read Boxing Pandora, and I'm only half joking. Now secede from the rest of that country and start a women's nation run by women, for women. Call yourself any religion you want, but, to hell with these men who are running your lives. And I would say that to any woman anywhere about anything, so I think Boxing Pandora brings up a lot of good points, but I think there are underlying problems with just how humans operate. And the misogyny is one of them. The racism is another. And I just choose the misogyny lens to kind of look at that.
And I think it's a great observation, and I try to be candid in the book. This is not a solution for every problem. We're not moving from Pandora to panacea.
Yeah.
It would fix certain kinds. It'd be less helpful for things like women just because of their distribution. That's true. But it could help if you had an area where people said, we think like Frank, we don't want to treat our women that way. We're tired of living in a country in which that's the norm. Then secession could be a way to either negotiate a better deal or get out for all the people who live there, not just the women, but for the men who live in that space who want the kind of vision you're describing. So it's a way to, it could work in both directions, and it could.
Hey, do me a favor when you
this kind of policy.
When you write another piece like the one for the Wall Street Journal, Ernie, my producer, and I are tracking with you now. Please keep us current on what you're doing.
Happy to do so.
And I'd love to have you back as part of any kind of panel on any subject, because you have such a wide knowledge and interest in the book.
You've got great questions, and I love answering questions from people who have so obviously prepared as well as you have when you held up that book.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. And the length of, we could go another 6 hours. I could get to my other 6 notes here, but thank you so much for writing the book. I'm Frank Schaeffer. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I'm talking to Timothy William Walters, and his book is Boxing Pandora, Rethinking Borders, States and Secession in a Democratic World. And it's wonderful because your little glimpses and illustrations into history and place and time, whether it's Woodrow Wilson or anybody else, World War I and II, and the aftermath is really wonderfully done. And again, I just love the article. I'm going to mention it one more time before we go away. It was in the Wall Street Journal, January 8, 2024, Genocide in My Classroom. And it was really just about this whole issue of the right of free speech and how that has to be defended. So I love the views in that article, and I found the book really engaging. Thank you so much. This was great.